Greetings. Welcome to another session. This is session 17 of Black Theology, Black Church, Theology 333. I'm Dr. Greg Jones, and I will be bringing you a session this time dealing with 5 issues. We're going to touch base. I'm going to give you a review of the 5 issues that we're talking about. But today, what we're going to focus in on is alternative religious leaders. We talked a little bit last time about Marcus Garvey and some of his work, but I want you to look at what is popularly called cult leaders. We don't want to use that. That's a derogatory word. We want to just talk about alternative religious leadership in America, in the African-American religious experience. We will continue to explore the 5 issues that impact the African-American church at this time. Remember, lynching and domestic terrorism is part of the church at this time. Jim Crow laws within the nation, the black migrations from south to north and west, the radical nature of the African-American poor, and that has something to do with this alternative religious leadership, as well as the rise of the religious and political alternatives themselves. Before we continue to consider the growth of the church, I want you to take a moment to hear. I want to share a couple of people with you just so that we can understand the full scope of the development of the African American church. I'm going to give you a listing of African American women who have been important up to this time in the African American religious experience. We will do a special session in terms of women and womenist theology, as well as the importance of women participation in the developing civil rights movement and the like. But I want you to remember and be reminded that women have always been a part of the African-American religious experience. The African-American women in ministry that I want you to focus in on at this particular time is, of course, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. We hear of those names, but there are other people like Jarena Lee, for example, who were recognized as a preacher and teacher in the AME and the AME Zion Church, the first ordained minister, female minister in the AME Church, in AME Zion Church. Harriet Tubman, Black Moses, Sojourner Truth, orator and speaker. Ida B. Wells, who is a womanist suffrage leader, but she also addresses the issue of lynching. Nanny Helen Burroughs is the National Baptist Convention USA educator and organizer. She did lots of work in terms of the African American church in the Baptist community. And then there's recently there was a lady by the name of Anna Pauline Murray, and I lift her up because some of her poetry in Dark Testament speaks to the issues that we have been dealing with today in terms of injustices in America, especially with the Trayvon Martin verdict and things of that nature. Anna Pauline Murray, she's a lawyer. She was important in the civil rights movement, and she wrote a book of poetry called Dark Testament. I'll be sharing some of that with you. Also, as a part of this alternative religious leadership, I want you to be reminded that there were not just men who were a part of that group, but a young lady by the name of Ida Robinson was a famous alternative religious leader, a prophet, if you will, organized fellowships and had a huge following in the African American community at this particular time. Time period we're looking at the turn of the century up into and through the Depression, and we will be talking a little about these individuals as we get closer to the civil rights movement and looking at some of the alternative theology that is being offered in terms of women's theology and the like. Okay, let's talk about a rationale for religious and political alternatives to the African American church. Most of the Christian churches that we see at this particular time were political moderates as it relates to racism, institutional racism, and addressing the issues of justice in American culture, American society. There weren't a whole lot of churches who were taking position and making things political. Some noted exceptions were the AME Zion Church, the Baptist Independent Churches, the Methodist Church. Some of the Presbyterian congregational churches were certainly some of the churches that were beginning to raise questions. And we talked about Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. We talked about some of the work that he did in terms of reparations. We also talked about some of the individuals who were theologians, who were also Methodists at that particular time, Alexander Cromwell, and we talked about Edward Biden, and we talked about individuals who were involved in the church, but certainly had gone beyond that in terms of their position of nationalism. But there weren't a lot of congregational, denominational kinds of position taking in terms of racism at this particular time. Because of this, the response of the rural community and congregations to the mainstream congregations was, well, they weren't necessarily addressing the issues. The rural congregations, the people who were moving from the south to the north, kind of saw the mainstream churches, that we would call them, too cold, and sought to live in mainstream American culture too much. Remember, the mainstream churches sought to be educated and wealthy and accepted. So the whole idea of being a mainstream church was to fit in with American culture, American society. And as these blacks who were coming from the south to the north, who were freed slaves, were coming looking for a Pentecostal experience, looking for a holiness experience, looking for a place that was uplifting the aspiration of African Americans, the mainstream churches weren't fitting the bill. And so we see a movement out of the institutional churches into alternative religious communities. The recently freed slaves from the South did not fit well with the assimilation and accommodational strategy of the northern churches, urban churches. And we still see that today. I want you to pay attention to how the mainstream churches still try to fit in, assimilate, and accommodate into the American mainstream. Consequently, we see the alternative religious communities emerging from about 1910 to about 1940. And so the rise of the alternative religious communities, and I call them that as opposed to calling them cults, because cult is a derogatory kind of term that is utilized for individuals who have a turn. And if we look very closely at Jesus of Nazareth, he didn't belong into the mainstream Jewish culture of the time. He was in the Essene sect. He was an Essene. He was a Nazarene in the Essene sect. And so when we look at that, we see even Jesus Christ considered to be an alternative religious response to a need that the people have, even back 2,000 some odd years ago. So let's talk about some of these individuals that we see emerging in the African American religious experience. Individual number one, Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali. He was born in 1886. He died in 1929. He was born in North Carolina. His name, his birth name, and was Timothy Drew. He started the Moorish Science Temple of America. He combined a infusion of African, Islamic, and Old Testament Judeo-Christian values, along with some Eastern Asian kinds of religious communities. He felt that black people were descendants of the Moorish culture. Noble Drew Ali. He wanted to call the Africans in America Afro-Asiatics or Afro-Asians. He asked them to carry an ID, his following to carry an ID. He influenced W.D. Fard Muhammad and Elijah Muhammad in terms of his teachings, and he encouraged followers to incorporate Bey, B-E-Y, capital B-E-Y, or L, to the linguistic representations or names. He denounced Christianity on the whole as a religion for whites, created by whites, and he had about approximately 2,000 members. I mean, 20,000 members. 20,000 members he had. 20,000 members. He would put more science temples in basically the urban areas, and he had this membership across, say, the Great Lakes, in Detroit, in Chicago, in New York, places of this nature. Noble Drew Ali and the Moorish Science Temple. About 20,000 members. Alternative religious community to the mainstream Christian church. Father Major Divine. Father Major Divine is the second one. Born in 1877, died in about 1965. Born George Baker. His birthplace was South Carolina. Some said Maryland. Was involved in with a preacher named Samuel Morris. Took on the title Messenger of God. Samuel Morris thought that he was God himself, and he purported himself to be God. And this is where Baker, or Divine, Father Divine, learned this for. He named himself the messenger of God. In 1915, he moves to New York City. He purchases a home. He changed his name to Major Father Divine. 1915, he moves to New York City, purchased a home, changed his name to Father Divine, used employment, food, and fellowship. So he provided employment for people. He provided food and fellowship. He argued that he was God, suggested that the traditional church ignored God's people and God's people's situation. And so he kind of denounced the regular traditional Christian way, using the Bible for teaching, and created his own commandments. And one of those were to be communal in terms of your sharing. Communal sharing. He asked people to divest themselves of their goods and give to a common table, as is in Acts, the first and second chapters of Acts. We see that people have all things in common. He takes that. He encouraged people to save money, and he grew into about a 2.5 million member following. Basically, his following grew as the Depression came near and began to set upon the nation. He was arrested and sentenced and given a year in jail. During that time, he said that the judge was going to reap what he sowed for arresting him unjustly, and the judge dropped dead. And because of this, he was purported to have spiritual powers over life and death. He was looked at as being Father Divine. So he grows this basically alternative group of people into 2.5 million folks. He created a popularity. He had 150 peace missions. Those were homes. He helped hundreds of thousands of people during the Depression of 1929. Whites began to join this group and be a part of this group, and he had an interracial following. They joined Father Divine. He focused on benevolence, fellowship, and employment. He created a magazine called The Spoken Word. He called his followers angels, and he was basically seen to be God. He saw himself as divine messenger. He purchased a farm. He called it the Promised Land. He started a political movement, brought huge homes in New York, Philadelphia, and surrounding urban areas. When the Depression ended, he lost some of his followings, but he ended up having 75 homes, different homes, across the country. He died in 1965. That's Father Divine. Another alternative religious leader we're going to look at is called Daddy Grace. Daddy Grace. He was born in 1881. He died in 1961. Grace was born Marcelino Manuel de Gracia in Cape Verde, West Africa, on January 25th, 1881. He moved to New York, and then finally, he moved to New York through Bedford, Massachusetts. He claimed to visit the Holy Land and got his powers from the visit to the Holy Land. He ended up at New Bedford, Massachusetts. After a stint in the Holy Land, he claimed he had healing, the power of healing from this visit to the Holy Land. He started a large following along the Atlantic seaboard, as far south as North Carolina. And in 1925, he organized the United House of Prayer for All People. He called himself Daddy Grace. By followers, became Bishop Charles Emmanuel Grace. He never claimed divinity, but indicated that Scripture referred to that spoke of grace was speaking of him. That inference was to him. His followers related to him as if he was God. He had a strong Pentecostal and holiness influence. In his church, you would have shouting and fainting and trances, and most of the proceeds went to Daddy Grace, directly to Grace. Also, he had products, Daddy Grace soap, Daddy Grace flour, Daddy Grace food. He brought followers to pick up his products, and He had a flamboyant personality. He bought lots of real estate property up from Father Divine and from another prophet, a prophet by the name of Prophet Cherry. He bought huge buildings, and he set up these houses of prayer. He died suddenly in 1960. He amassed a fortune of about $4 million in total assets. These are just a few of the individuals who were involved in religious alternative leaders. We will take a look at the impact of nationalism on alternative leadership, and so we will look at Wallace Fard and Elijah Muhammad and the origins of the black Muslim community prior to the civil rights movement in America when we meet next time. Thank you.